Please, let's get settled and let's make the circle warm. So if you could please occupy these seats in the center so that our latecomers can sort of, fill the outer parts of the circle. And if our speakers can join us here so that Ayanda's not lonely on stage. So we're going to start in a bit. My name is Pindile, but I'll introduce myself once we're good and we're settled in about 30 seconds. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Like I said, my name is Pindile Gunene. I'm with FES, and I'm the program manager for democracy and political culture. I'm not alone here from FES. I've got a number of colleagues in the room, and my role is really very simple, is to extend a very warm welcome. I know it's warm outside, but to extend a very warm welcome to you all here, and to thank you for making time on this Thursday afternoon to come through and to listen to us. Just a few things before we get started. So this is the launch of the African Media Barometer, and you've got it in front of you. This particular document, I'm going to play a video in a few seconds that explains what this instrument is, its history, but also why it's important. But before I do that, I must add that this instrument doesn't belong to FES, or the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, for those of you who are hearing about us for the first time. It doesn't belong to the FES, it doesn't belong to just the FES Media Office that is based in Namibia, and it also doesn't belong to the Media Institute of Southern Africa. It's really an instrument that belongs to people in the sector, to media workers, to journalists, but also civil society organizations. And what the video will show is a process that we undertake when these meetings happen, and how this particular video is compiled. I must say that this instrument, how this particular report is compiled, this instrument is important, but the 2021 version is particularly important because it coincides with at least 2 years of the pandemic, which, as we know, affected access to information, affected media freedom, but also affected the sustainability of many media outfits. We all know about the job losses, the closures, the paywalls in an attempt to stay afloat, and all of that. So that's all important to take note. We are joined by participants online, so it's not just us in the room, but we're also joined by participants in Namibia, our colleagues at the FES Media Office in Namibia, who are going to be part of this discussion, watching and listening. I'd like to just play the video so that you get a sense about this instrument, though many of you are familiar with it, and many of you formed part of the process to put it together. I'm not going to name all of you, but you are here. So we acknowledge you. You are duly acknowledged as the panelists, as the moderators, as the rapporteurs, but also as former FES staff who've moved on and who are still doing the work of democracy. So let's play that video. Thank you.
FES Media Africa, in partnership with the Media Institute of Southern Africa, MISA, introduces the Africa Media Barometer, AMB. The AMB is a flagship project of FES Media Africa, developed in 2005. It is a homegrown analysis of media environments in sub-Saharan African countries. The AMB indicators are based on the African Commission for Human and People's Rights, principles on freedom of expression and access to information in Africa. What is the AMB? The African Media Barometer is a recognized tool for analyzing and evaluating the media landscape in sub-Saharan African countries. It is a very descriptive, perception-based index of the media environments, promotes representation, transparency, enabling environments, and advocacy for media in Africa. Did you know, until 2021, AMBs have been conducted 126 times in 32 sub-Saharan African countries, in some of these countries already for the 6th time. Benefits of AMB. The AMB has been used for promoting liberal, democratic, fair, and independent media in line with FES Media Africa's regional strategic objective. How is the AMB conducted? Every 3 to 4 years, a panel of 10 to 12 experts consisting of at least 5 media practitioners and 5 representatives from civil society meet to assess the media situation in their own country. Independent experts and media consultants serve as moderators and rapporteurs of the AMB. Did you know? This measurement tool can also assist public officials to better analyze the state of the media in their countries and improve media policies. Download a free copy of the African Media Barometer from www.facemedia-africa.fes.de.
All right, wonderful. I think the video does a much more, a very competent job in introducing the instrument. I must just add now that the AMB has been conducted now over 127 times, and those 32 African countries include Togo, Uganda, Mozambique, Eswatini, Lesotho, South Africa, Namibia, and many, many others. So this is quite an important instrument. But like I said, the instrument doesn't belong to FES Media or FES generally. It's for practitioners and it's for the sector. And to show that, I'm going to hand over to Ayanda, who's going to help us to moderate the panel discussion and the conversation and to introduce our speakers. Thank you very much, Ayanda. I'm going to step down now. Thanks.
You can give her an applause if you want. I heard it coming. Awesome stuff. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much indeed for making time to come through. My name is Ayanda Nyati. Typically, I'm behind a lens and don't underestimate the comfort that comes with that. I don't have to see the people who I'm speaking to, so bear with me today in this uncharted territory. But hopefully, we all have an invested interest in having robust discussions about what the AMB is about. And more importantly, we walk out of here feeling this was time well spent on a Thursday afternoon when, let's face it, given the news cycle, and I'm sure your interest in the media, there are many other competing interests for you to be here today. So since you are here, I'll start by saying thank you very much for making the time, and hopefully it is something that you're happy you chose to be a part of. So, as was already mentioned, part of my job, for lack of a better term, is to facilitate the discussion, so that makes me the least important person in the room. The people who I think ought to have a lot of your attention, no pressure, are the panelists that we have with us today. Individuals, by the way, who I've worked with before in some way or the other in the form of perhaps interviews we've done. I've certainly watched some of these individuals do their work, read some of their work as well. It's people who I have tremendous respect for. Oliver Dixon should be joining us virtually. Hopefully, once we're able to sort that out, he'll be with us. He is, of course, a TV and a radio presenter, also part of the 10 panelists, by the way, who contributed to this AMB. That's significant. Haupaleli Palaetzile is also part of those 10 panelists. She is present with us in the room. She's an activist as well as a campaigns manager, works also with civil society. Tepiso Makwetla. I shouldn't say this, but I watch her a lot when I probably shouldn't, as it were, but a person who I have great respect for. She's with the SABC, a fellow colleague in what we do, and I can't wait to hear some of her thoughts in where we are and what the way forward perhaps looks like. And then also joining us is Mbali Jomo, who is also within the media industry with the Association of Independent Producers, a voice from community media, which I'm sure you'll all agree is incredibly important. Introductions out of the way. Let me also thank the Mail and Guardian, who I understand is a partner in what we're doing today, and everybody else was able to make this possible. with that, let's get to it. I'm going to take this mic. Hopefully, at the risk of embarrassing myself, nothing bad happens, because I don't have a mic with me as I sit down. And then I'm going to ask Khau to join us. I think it's the overhead projector that's in your face. Is it possible to... Probably not, hey, because Oliver might join us via the overhead projector. Okay. We'll bear with you for today. In fact, you're going to pay for this, as it were. All right. So when it comes to unpacking not only the findings of this report, but where we are, we obviously spoke for choice about where to begin. And how you might as well pay for your sins already. When you think about the state of South African media currently, do you worry? Should we be worried? Oh.
I'll try to speak with this thing on.
Okay, so we're going to try move the furniture, as it were. Okay.
Yeah. I think hi everybody, apologies for that. I think it's funny because I just left the media 4 months ago. So I would say, there's one thing I always say on Twitter, and that is protect journalism.
Yeah.
And that is because I believe in the importance of what journalism is and what the news media does. I think it's very important, and I think this country has a very vibrant media landscape and journalists who are interested in doing a lot. But I do think we should be worried, and I think the report will reflect on it. I think some of the things we reflected on, I think for me that's very close to my heart rather, is how much there's not much resources for the media in this country to do its work.
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing that I'm really passionate about, because I've been in the media industry just 4 months ago, and I worked a lot with young journalists who, for me, I feel are not being equipped enough to do the critical fact-checking, research, and analysis work that is needed in this country. I also think one of the other things that really worries me about the media is South Africa, for everything, we have laws, we have the constitution, we have legislation that works for us, but the issue is of implementation and whether those things really work for us and we gain from them. So we have all this legislation that sort of protects us, and you'll see we score very high as a country on that. But a lot of journalists don't feel safe to do their work. That's why there's quite an exodus of people leaving the media industry. People don't feel safe to do their work. People don't feel like they're doing enough in terms of doing their work. I mean, I left because I felt like I wasn't contributing enough, and there was not much resources for me to do so. I hope I'm making sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
So those are the type of things I'm really worried about. But the other thing that I speak a lot about, the third thing that I'm really worried about when it comes to the media industry in South Africa, is the emergence of fake news and misinformation. I think it's something that we should be concerned about, especially with the emergence of social media and the type of things we see online, and how much they derail the work that we do, and how quick and easy it is to spread a narrative in our country, which is quite scary. And it happens a lot. So I think there's quite a lot to do. I'm now in civil society and I'm in research, and I've raised the importance of that research and working alongside the media to ensure that we assist with making sure that the things we put out there are factual and they make sense, because I feel like South Africans we owe South Africa the truth with a lot of that's happening.
And the reality is we're unlikely to be able to pull it off on our own. Hopefully that's where civil society comes in. Platforms like this with FES and what they're doing with this particular initiative. But you've given a voice in some respects to new entrants into the media space and the challenges that they face. Tepiso, the AMB itself is looking at a particular period of where we are, as it were, it's specific years. Your participation in the media, though, exists outside of that boundary. What's your reading of the evolution so far? Are you getting a sense that it feels a bit harder now than it was perhaps when you started?
Yes and no. I've been in the industry for more than 20 years now. And when I reflect on some of the things, there have been great strides made. But unfortunately, we've also walked back on some of the progress in several respects. And I'd like to point out on some of the issues. I mean, this is in broad strokes, speaking about the lack of diversity, inclusivity in media houses, not only along gender lines, racial lines, class lines. It made me reflect back at a time when I started. There's a private joke that I have with two friends of mine. They call me Russell. And it's because when I started at a commercial radio station, and a gentleman with a very heavy Scottish accent called in and said, "Oh, what are you saying anyway? What is your name, Russell?" And I said, "Sir, I'm sorry, I can't even understand what you're saying." Yeah. And it's that kind of discrimination that you still have to face and fight against in terms of we spoke about in the report media ownership and self-censorship. A lot of attention seems to be, and rightfully so, on the national public broadcaster. And I'd like to just say to the writers of the report, you speak about the SABC interchangeably as the state or the public broadcaster. We are the public broadcaster. A lot of us work there for that particular reason. We fight to stay there for that particular reason because we understand the imperative of serving the public. So there have, it speaks about favoritism, for instance, how there's lack of upward mobility because of those things. I don't even know if it's about shareholder interest or fear of upsetting advertisers, but I'm just pointing out that some of these things have not changed from the times when I started, when there was a lot of pushback for having a young black girl read news on what is considered to be essentially a white radio station. And it was, the issue of experience, training was spoken about. Those are still major issues. When I started, I had broadcast training, and I learned on the job as a cub reporter. There's very little training in the jobs that we do now, specifically for mid-career journalists. I know the IAJ does its bit, and there are a lot of programs. But even then, unfortunately, I feel like it's a bruskap thing. Who do you know? Yeah. Who's going to get you into that type of training for your own personal development and advancement? I could go on ad nauseum. So please stop me because I will talk. But I hope I'm making sense in some of the things and the issues that I'm raising.
And this is really also just about getting your initial thoughts on an issue that, let's be frank, we're not going to be able to fully exhaust during our time here. But it's a great moment to also bring you in, I guess. Oh, DJ, thank you. Thabisa, for instance, speaks about where she started. Many of us started in community radio stations. In fact, that is, my goodness, my own journey is characterized by going there and getting everything wrong, because that's important in some respects. But it doesn't also mean that it's a space to be ignored, because there are individuals who rely on community radio stations. Is that matching up with the support, though? Nothing.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. This is my first time on this platform, so I really appreciate being here. And as the two ladies have said, I think I must also say it, I hope I will make sense because everybody's saying it. But thank you for that question. I think we must also differentiate between what you are talking about as broadcasting and us who are in the print media sector. Sure. It might be that the environment is different, but the phases and what you are saying is the same. We have had a lot actually, of young men and women who started with us in our publications, who are now in the mainstream media. And it just shows the role that we play in the media sector as a whole. So the community media sector plays a very important role in that regard. So we must also include it in conversations like this. And I think when we talk about our sector, and the challenges that we face, they must also be at the same level as the mainstream media that we hear about this afternoon. So it then rests on everybody here and whoever is lobbying and whoever is trying to support the sector to continue to lobby and continue to act on behalf of those media entities that are out there, because had we not been there, most of the journalists that are in the industry would not be here. I saw on the report that one of your guys who contributed to the report previously, his name is Kulegane Magubane. He was an intern in my magazine some years ago, around 2010. But here he's here now. He's in Gauteng. He's making it. So it just shows the important role that we play as a sector.
Yeah, I hope he's still answering your calls and hasn't become too important, as it were. I understand Oliver might have also managed to join. I saw his picture a short while ago. Is there an indication in the room of whether or not Oliver can hear us now? Yeah? Oliver, are you there somewhere in the stratosphere? Okay, I can hear him faintly. I'm not sure if people in the room might be able to. Okay, whilst we get that right, perhaps it's also an opportunity for us to speak broadly about the report itself, by the way, and in case you missed it, you might have it on your desk. I see some of you already going through it. It's divided mainly into 4 different sections. And I guess part of what we'll do is just reflect broadly on the sections themselves. And I'm looking forward more specifically to speak about what the way forward looks like. You know, we always criticize Tsepiso and Gao and everybody else. South Africa's ability to diagnose things very well. You know, I think sometimes we fall into the risk of doing the same thing without being able to give a prognosis about what the remedy looks like. So Oliver, if you are there, now that I've done my padding for the afternoon, your initial thoughts about where we are. I mean, I asked Gao about whether or not she's worried about, you know, the state we're in as a media fraternity. You are part of those panels who contributed to this report. On the back of that, were you left comforted or discomforted, a bit more worried? Yeah, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Fantastic. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. Unfortunately, I'm down with COVID, so my voice is also a little bit gone. But I hope I'm audible to everyone. Look, Ayanda. So the report is because it's a barometer. It's comparative in its nature, as barometers are. It's comparative to a previous cycle, and as you know, this particular barometer happens in a 3-year cycle. And it's also comparative in some instances, at least as it pertains to some of the discussions we had in the room, to other parts of the world, particularly other parts of the continent. And by that comparative, South African media is in a brilliant place. Media freedom, as reflected in the report, is well protected. Media are able to go about their work unencumbered. And for the most part, journalists are not persecuted by the state, you know, and so that's a beautiful environment to be able to operate in. And so I'm glad to be, and I'm happy to, and proud to be a media practitioner in an environment that upholds those sets of freedoms. Yeah. At an operational level, however, there are a few impediments, right? And we can discuss some of them. For instance, how editors and editors-in-chiefs decide to disperse and use the resources available on a newsroom floor, for instance. In some of the discussions, we realize that it reflects a lot. It reflects just how undiverse media newsroom floors are. And it's not just diversity by gender or by race or sexual orientation or class, right? And it's not innocuous that we mention diversity matters, because it matters in how a story is told. I know we're not allowed to quote anyone from the room, but I'll use Gao being on the panel as an excuse to do that. In one of the discussions we had during the Barometer panel, there was a discussion around how newsrooms aren't keeping up with the sensitivity of stories, right? And one such example, Gao in particular raised, was how reporting happens around suicide, right? And so, for instance, it is always reported in the media when somebody dies by suicide that so and so committed suicide, so and so killed themselves, if that editor's a little bit crass on the day, right? But the real and important framing of a story is always to say that so and so died by suicide. And that slight nuance is an important one, and really can only be picked up in a newsroom where diversity exists but is also allowed to fill the room. That's to say, you're not going to shut down a first-year journalist or a third-year journalist just because they're junior in the newsroom floor, and you've been doing this for 20 plus years. And so that battle is important. The contestation of ideas is important to exist in the newsroom floor, and for that diversity to be taken serious. For instance, how stories are reported on when reporting about transgendered people, or how stories are being reported on when we speak about sexual violence. Those framings matter and can only really be picked up where it is in error, can only really be picked up when there is diversity in the room. So those are spaces that we need to improve on. Tepiso mentions training. Training was a big one. And I cringed a few days ago when I watched a very senior colleague in the industry report on a court case. And this person says, applicant so-and-so lost their appeal. But there was never an appeal. It was merely a leave to appeal, right? And lawyers came out mentioning just that minor difference. And that just goes to show the lack of, for instance, legal journalism we have in the country, that we can get such minor technical things wrong, and that shapes and derails a story entirely. And this is from a senior colleague, right? And so I do think that we need training at all levels. So when we spoke about why training doesn't happen as often as it should, a number of the practicing journalists in the room, including Kulegane, who was mentioned just now. He's not in Joburg, actually. He's in Cape Town with Fin24, I think. Journalists shared their experience, and some of the people on the panel were themselves editors and editors-in-chiefs, and worked in various parts of the media ecosystem and value chain. They mentioned that for an editor with limited resources, and really there are limited resources, how a journalist is deployed matters. So every hour matters. The amount of stories you can turn out of them matters. Taking them out of the field or taking them away from the desk to go and do training for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day means that you have less stories at the end of the day from that particular journalist, or less reports from that journalist. And that really, as an editor, worries you, especially when you're chasing clicks or when you're chasing views and all of these sorts of things, right? And where volume matters. And it's almost always impossible for journalists to do training on the job, because then the training isn't as effective. It comes down to then a resource battle. How do we make sure that we resource newsrooms enough so that an editor doesn't worry about not meeting the quota for the day just because they took a couple of reporters off the desk so that they can go to essential training? And I noticed that essential training seeped through during the local government elections. For instance, when there was a lot of reporting about local government matters, but no one actually saying, let's take a look at the MFMA and let's take a look at the Auditor General report and actually go through the detail of it and ask the critical questions. We all sort of just did surface level secondary reporting, headline, clickbaity type of reporting around it. And that was, again, indicative of the lack of training and expertise in that field.
Yeah,
but it's also
Oliver, let me come in there. Yeah.
Also,
I think you come through loud and clear, and I realized my question was broad, so fair. It's 1-1. Let me try narrow it down a bit more. And Tsepiso, I think I'd like to get your take on this. Part of what Oliver has said in the latter part of his response is absolutely valid, right? The kind of depth, nuance, technical skills, and know-how in the newsroom is desperately needed, but there are reasons for that, right? COVID is the most recent one in some respects, and many others before that. Not that that should give journalists and journalism a get-out-of-jail card, but I wonder how we could acknowledge that and still do right by audiences, as it were.
I think it was alluded to, and it's a big part of it. Beat journalism, that is virtually non-existent.
Yeah.
if we're going to talk about institutional memory, that is one place to start. We spoke about how news agencies, newsrooms have been decimated because of COVID-19, and I mean, the report also deals about what happened at the SABC. I mean, there's a rationale to it, yes, but then if you force journalists to then take on multiple tasks, they're already run down, they're not fairly compensated, and by the way, training is not and I think this is what I'm lamenting, the fact that it should be periodic. There should be a plan in place. A career path means that there is a developmental agenda.
There should be intention somewhere.
Yes, indeed. So, and by the way, it doesn't necessarily have to be external. Skills transfer can occur within the actual organization. So the lack of intentionality is why we find ourselves in a situation where, and it's also a thing about deployment, where people's strengths are not matched with the task at hand. And that's why I went to the issue of favoritism and unfair, and lack of transparency mostly. It's not just about the pay grade issue. It's just about somebody is working and has an aptitude for a certain thing. You either grow that talent or you give it to somebody who has a better understanding, and then you have a mentorship program going. So there are many ways of dealing with it. I think if we wanted to build stronger newsrooms as well, we'd also have greater latitude in terms of, we all say that newsrooms are contested ground, but we actually ignore that because we have to deal with hierarchy. And by the way, I need to get to this because it's a burning issue, and I've got colleagues from the SABC who are here. Yeah. The whole issue of how the SABC really, yes, went down the tubes at some point or the other, but I think it's something that happens periodically. It's a systemic problem as far as I'm concerned. It's not down to one individual, because some of those managers also carry out their own agendas because of fear of authority, whether it's internal or external. So you run down the newsroom that way. So journalists who have a particular passion for particular stories or bring to the fore narratives that ordinarily would not be promoted in that organization are shut down. And it's always done by way of saying, you know, my superior doesn't want this. So it's always in the name of somebody. But we know that in corporate culture generally, these things happen. So I think we've got to fix the system in terms of reporting lines, the transparency of it. People must adhere to the rules. The codes of ethics, code of conducts are there, so why are we not implementing them in the newsroom? And it's from a holistic point of view. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah. Consequence management, I guess, forms part of it as well, you know, for people who are found to not have done those things.
And diversity management, which was something that was mentioned. If we're going to say there's representativity, there's a style guide that is then formulated to deal with some of those issues as well.
Often, because the gap is so large between the people who have the skills and who are available and the people who don't have the skills and are available, is that you find individuals who, quite frankly, I don't want to say are not qualified for the job, but have a journey still to travel in being able to fulfill certain things. Those are the ones having to go to the State Capture Commission, for instance, having to do incredibly complex cases like the Zuma matter at this moment. The people with the skills are leaving, and that leaves a gap for those without the skills to be forced to fill it. I'm often compassionate to those individuals, right, who often don't get that slack from the public for getting things wrong. You know, how do we at least, I don't know, the word is not protect, but assure those individuals that even if things go wrong, they are actually still learning, and quite frankly, it's not their fault that they're in those kind of positions. Should those people even take up those posts, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a scary place to be in, because as she was speaking, I was thinking about how when you go into the newsroom, it's such a competitive space for us as journalists, right? So we are in a space where we are in competition. We are not a team. I always never understood that, right?
Even within the newsroom.
I'm talking about within the newsroom.
Sure.
So you come in and everybody's doing their own thing, and it's about outshining each other on who has the best story and who can do the best research. That's why those people end up being isolated, right? There's not enough room for us working together and being a team. We can cover a big event like the elections together, but everyone has their own agenda and what they want to achieve. The favoritism that she was also talking about. That's the other thing about the newsroom that gets very complicated. It's that whole idea that everyone is competing against each other. And it's very hard to even admit that, I'm not doing okay. I remember having a chat with a colleague who was working for, I won't mention a station. It's famous for a lot. And it's famous for, we're laughing, but it's famous for something serious, depression in the newsroom. And this colleague she kept struggling with the amount of how much she was being treated as if she's not doing enough. She kept saying, I can't even speak about being depressed because then I will be accused of not performing and I will be pushed out. Those are some of the things that journalists are afraid to say, right? And afraid to speak about. There's not enough room. So I don't want to assure individuals of anything I want us to have spaces to be able to converse, to be able to feel safe and have discussions. I want SANEF to actually be accessible. I want SANEF for journalists to feel like SANEF is for them and they have room in SANEF to raise their own issues. Do you understand? So those kinds of things, you just don't need assurance. I remember during COVID-19, I was not okay. I was not okay. So I put together a few senior journalists and I said, let's have a Zoom meeting and just invite anybody who's available. Obviously, we couldn't have everybody, and let's talk about how we're feeling right now. And journalists came through and young people came through and they said, I watch you on Twitter, maybe talking to Tsidi Madia, for example, and saying, if you're feeling this way, what about me who's learning? And after that conversation, people were feeling more encouraged and they're feeling like there's more access. So there needs to be an intention to have access to those platforms so that we can have these conversations. For me, even I can say now, I went into some stories not knowing what the hell I'm doing.
Yep.
And you literally have to get the ground running on your own. And it's that institutional knowledge you were talking about that is necessary and needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think many people, at the risk of embarrassing myself, can attest to that, where you're assigned to a story, you're not really quite sure what it's about, and you're hoping that's not the top story for the afternoon. But part of what the report in Bali also explores, and it's in relation to what we're discussing, is, just the desperate staff shortages and the juniorization of some of those newsrooms. Mainstream media, as it's termed, is not the only, let's call it sector of the industry going through that. I imagine it's right through, right? How do you keep the ball rolling in that space?
I think in our case, because we are used to an environment of limited resources, for us it's business as usual, if we can call it like that. Some of us have been running publications for over 20 years, 25 years. In this way. So like when COVID came for us, yes, it did have an impact in terms of the challenges of moving around, in terms of accessing support for advertising and all of that. But at the end of the day, it was just a normal type of business environment that we are used to. So yes, young people are coming in at this stage and they come from institutions of higher learning like your technicons and all your universities and all of that. But I think with the experience that we do have in our businesses, we are able to coach them and mentor them to be at a level where if they apply for interviews, for jobs in the mainstream media, for instance, they are taken just like that. So we have seen that has worked for our sector.
Sure.
And we don't, for us it's just a way of we call ourselves the springboard to the mainstream media, and I think over the years we've come to accept that it's like that. But I think as the time goes, there needs to be change in terms of the support that we are getting, both from the mainstream media, collaborations that need to happen where we share resources and where we share experiences and expertise on media.
Yeah, it's a piece.
You know, it's sad to hear you say that you're the springboard to the mainstream media. There's so much wealth and depth at community media outlets.
Yeah.
During the July riots, the story was with the community radio stations, television stations, print outlets. Even now, I was saying to a colleague, Isaac, now that, I've done a few workshops over the years with community radio stations, and I wish that there was a formal feeder system into mainstream media where not only is government obligated to spend a certain amount of its advertising revenue with mainstream media, but we mainstream media actually are obligated to use the stories from community media, because the insight is we tend to have such a national viewpoint and sometimes force and follow a particular agenda. As you said, it's such a competitive, so sometimes the real objective falls by the wayside. Who broke it first, who's more salacious about it. But a better understanding of COVID-19, for instance, I was thinking, there are countries on the continent who have better community health systems than South Africa has, for instance. Yeah. And they fared better in terms of dealing with the pandemic. So that is the concept for me, that we should be working in tandem. There shouldn't be some sort of hierarchy. And
what does that look like? Oliver, I haven't forgotten you, by the way. And this is what happens when you don't arrive. But we'll come to you just now. Tsepiso, just on that thought, how should the SABC, for instance, be leading the way insofar as that is concerned, given their mandate?
Listen, I think the SABC has an obligation.
Is the mic on?
Oh, sorry. I think the SABC has an obligation as a public broadcaster, given its mandate, to have a closer cooperation with community-based organizations. We talk about collaboration with civil society. I think that is also very important. There needs to be some sort of information sharing programs. Even if we're talking about training, training doesn't need the types of resources that we're projecting it to mean. If you look at publications such as Ground Up, for instance, I love the work that they do.
Yeah.
We could learn so much more as journalists in these mainstream media outlets, and even between us there's competition about who does what story better. It is the role of the SABC, obviously, to be more representative of the demographics of this country and the lived experiences of South Africans. How do we do that if we are not in close collaboration with the grassroots entities that speak to these people on a daily basis?
Yeah, got you. I remember doing a story in Alex when there was just one of the many protests that have taken place there. In this particular instance, there was a shutdown of the community over the usual stuff. And quite frankly, the people who are running the lay of the land, as it were, the people who had access to the information, were those who were working at Alex FM. Many of us in mainstream media were actually asking them about where to turn, where to go, who to ask, what's happening next. So to your point, there's a massive contribution that mainstream community media makes, and I'm hoping we'll be speaking about what the support looks like in just a moment. But let's shift gears slightly. Oliver, we can bring you back into the discussion. Part of what this report also explores is the independence or lack thereof of the South African media. And things that are cited, and I'm sure you'll know this, is this concerted effort from some people in society to actually direct narratives, sometimes in the establishment of certain channels, as it were. There was that Project Wave from the State Security Agency we heard about from the Zondo Commission. People were apparently paid to be on panels, on TV, to say specific stuff, just so they could direct the narrative, as it were. When it comes to us evaluating how independently we are able to operate, where are the areas of concern and perhaps, by extension, the places where we can improve?
Look, so one, journalism in South Africa has taken a bit of a credibility knock over the last couple of years. I mean, Bell Pottinger being able to do that to South African journalism and make it that divided is indicative of that, right? But then there are also some own goals that some of our colleagues are scoring. One famous example that came up in discussion during the Barometer panel was Ranjeni Munsami, for instance, who has since disappeared from the public light after it was revealed at the Zondo Commission, for instance, that she took money from SSA to fix her personal vehicle and all of that sort of stuff. And that sort of blurred the lines there a little bit. You know, and that's one example of where it took a credibility crisis, a credibility knock. Another example is Piet Ramperi's 10 Babies, for instance. That's another instance where it's not about the integrity of the journalism, but rather about the quality of their work just being purely sloppy and then going on to defend it like for life and death, as though it was an example of good journalism when it really wasn't. And how our political reporting in the country, for instance, has become increasingly polarized. You can almost tell which publications will take which slant. Should a story break about the president, or should a story break about whoever the president's factional oppositions are in the ANC, for instance, and that's a little bit worrying, right? And that's notwithstanding the SABC. That's outside of the SABC. Although the SABC also still has its own credibility crisis to fix, not just in recent times, but also historically, right? And so, you know, that leaves a lot of South African media consumers a little bit worried around the credibility of the information that they're accessing. And we need to take that serious, because once an institution's credibility goes down the drain, the value of that institution may well not exist, right? And so what can we do to in terms of moving forward? One, just pay journalists better. That's a good start. Two, and importantly, it's important that we take ethics training in journalism education serious. And ethics training is not just that random semester course you do in first year and then move on. It's a continuous thing that you need to do over and over and over and over again, right? For instance, many journalists for the first time a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, during the Dross rape, for instance, learned that you can't actually publish the name of a minor during a rape in a rape case. It was the first time many journalists learned that. And that's something that you learn during journalism ethics, right? Because it pertains very specifically to the laws of what you can and can't do as a journalist. And that training needs to be refreshed every, cyclically, because it's important then that things that journalists may have forgotten are reminded to them, but also as practices change and stories become increasingly more complex, that we understand the continuous application of what that looks like. So I think as far as the credibility is concerned, that's in part the way forward. But I do think that SANEF and various other media pressure groups need to do a little bit more to demand higher standards of not just transparency, but of ethical reporting and non-tainted reporting, specifically when it pertains to highly politicized cases and highly politicized events in the country. And I think, that will be difficult to police with private interest, because no matter how hard we try, we'll never be able to remove private interests and private ownership interests from media practice.
Sure. It's very concerning, of course, when journalists are not seen as journalists, but are seen as players in stories that they actually report on, which is what you're touching on, Oliver. I'm cognizant of the time as well and the schedule, by the way, so I'm going to ask one more question from our panelists. I'm hoping you've been jotting your questions down, because after that, it's over to you, at least in the room, and hopefully you'll be able to ventilate any other questions from people who are joining us virtually. How, at the risk of embarrassing both you and me, we spoke about earlier on the levels of protection or lack thereof for some journalists as we do our work in the face of everything else we've mentioned today. Typically, it feels like there are specific journalists who are targeted for specific reasons, and that has a chilling effect on the many other journalists who then can't do their work the way they should.
And I think I agree with what you're saying, and I agree with a lot of what Oliver's saying about credibility, but I also want to add that there is an effort by some elements, politicians, to discredit journalists for doing the work that they're doing because they don't want the public to know the truth. And that is, the discrediting comes in different ways: intimidation, threats, derailing what you're doing. So, for example, we mentioned Karima Brown in the report. There's been many other journalists who's been intimidated. I remember all I was doing was tweeting during the State Capture Commission. I mean, obviously I was reporting, but I tweeted a lot. And I would get threats on my Twitter DMs from people who would tell me I'm cutting my career short. If you have people outside of journalism telling you that you're cutting your career short, I mean, how do they get involved? Something recently just happened to Lukhona Mnguni, who had tweeted something recently, and a government spokesperson, I think it was Clayson Monyela, made a threat. And soon after that, Lukhona Mnguni was removed. And what should people think? Should people think that was just a threat? But because it looked like a threat. I just can't remember what he said.
Yeah,
but
it was along the lines of Lukhona being careful about his line of questioning about certain things.
Oh, he was calling certain government officials on Power FM Amasela, which means thieves. And the spokesperson he was just putting it as it is, because some of them are thieves. And he made a threat. And, I mean, we can talk about the style in which Lukhona was speaking, but essentially a threat was made. There are journalists who are doing research and stories on corruption. And if you are making such public threats, and we are seeing Lukhona actually being removed from Power FM and going somewhere else, that's why some journalists are going to be careful in how they tell their stories. If you see journalists like Tidi Madia being threatened all the time, being bullied online all the time, you are going to be scared. I mean, I've invited a lot of young journalists to panels like this or radio conversations about media, not the stories they covered. And they are scared because they're like, which editor is going to be listening to me criticizing what we're doing in the office or whatever? They don't want to talk. They're like, maybe a person more senior can do it. And I'm like, your voice matters. It's important to hear from you. It's important to hear what we're doing wrong, what we're doing right from your perspective. But people are afraid.
Sure. I see you reacting to Piso. I have to get your take before we open questions, by the way. Same question.
It's food for thought on so many levels. I mean, the fact that you're absolutely right that there's protection for particular journalists, but there's also, and I know it sounds like I'm going to be harping on about this, that the SABC and its own credibility issues, it's important because we are the only national public broadcaster. But the lens through which we're seen, granted, it's nuanced, but let's not forget that commercial media itself needs to be scrutinized. Its own practices, the unethical behavior of some of the newsrooms. So let's if we're saying we're having constructive criticism of the media fraternity, we're building it and we're improving it, let's do it all round, because we want a national conducive environment, bar the responsibilities borne by each of the media outlets. And the thing about media ownership, let's not forget that influences a great deal of how that happens. And the thing about intimidation, I'm nodding because I've been through it a lot.
Yeah.
I've been through it a lot. Interestingly enough, a fellow journalist who was going on about how their media cliques and cabals, and I agreed with him, because let's stop trying to shield ourselves from the truth. It's there, it happens. And I fought for that conversation to go on. I went as high as my GE of News and Current Affairs to have that discussion on. All of the people that he was accusing, granted, they refused to come in. I understood why. It is their right to not engage. But I did have somebody who could offset, and that was Media Monitoring Africa. William Bird was willing to come and talk about the very issues that we're talking about. But then after that, he and his bots went for me for a whole 2 weeks straight.
Sure.
The kind of language, even, doubting my credentials. I mean, it's par for the course, I guess. You got to grow thick skin. But what I'm saying is that, you know, we don't deal with things on a principial level in the media. If we're talking about your SANEFs, if we talk about your media organizations that are there to protect journalists, let's not make journalists feel like certain people deserve protection and others don't. I can take care of myself. I'm a big girl. I know when to engage and when not to engage. And social media, for all its great wealth of alternative views, there are places that I just don't go for the sake of my own sanity and health.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is these things we've got to fix as well systemically. By the way, I think that there needs to be free emotional or well-being mental health services for journalists. Our daily jobs are stressful in themselves. COVID-19, if it was anything, was indicative of that. A lot of us lost close family members. Some of us were sick. And there were journalists who wouldn't even say that they were COVID-19 positive because of the fear of losing a paycheck.
Yeah.
Job security is something that we have to talk about in this industry.
Yeah, it has a bearing on how you do your work and how that unfolds. How? And then we'll open up for questions, by the way. I'm not quite sure how that's going to unfold, so I'm going to freestyle. Bear with me. But have your say, and then we'll take questions. Yeah.
So I just wanted to add that one other thing that's quite important is when it comes to accountability, when it comes to issues of byline, a lot of the times you find that when something goes wrong in the media industry, the person who gets the flag is the person who wrote the story, but we don't talk about the processes that had to come into place before that story got out, and that journalist becomes, you know, our scapegoat, because they are the only person we can, or not they are the only person, because other people don't want to take accountability for their actions. So that's also very important.
Yeah. Where were the editors? Where was the Sabc? Who was doing the fact checking, etc., etc.? I'm hoping there are some questions to be able to take us forward. So if you just raise your hand, I'll actually get up and walk to you, and then we'll take it from there. I imagine, panelists, by the way, you'll take the questions, because, as I said, I'm just a roving guy with the mic. So we'll start here.
Thanks, Ayan. My name is Reggie Mwalusi. I'm from the South African National Editors Forum. First, I'd like to say well done on the report, but maybe before I proceed with other things, I'd like to say I've been glancing through the report and I see what's in there, but I think it would help if what panelists have said and is captured in the report, it's further interrogated so that it doesn't appear as if it's some gossiping or whatever not. I mean, if you say some journalists have cozy relationships with politicians, perhaps try to go further and give those details, because that doesn't help when we as a fraternity are working towards regaining the trust. And now something has been put in the report, but there's no further interrogation to that. And I think the other aspect I saw was where it's mentioned there are people who are earning far more in newsrooms than their peers. I was an editor-in-chief. I had white senior editors under me, and I can tell you I earned far more than them. And the company I worked for paid me as editor-in-chief. So perhaps also some examples there where we say, if we are going to say there's a radio presenter in the quantum of 2 million per annum, and his producer is at 500K per annum, perhaps let's go further and interrogate those. Maybe one of the panelists, Rao, mentioned SANEF, and I think as an organization running an office of free people, we get a lot on our shoulders, and that's okay. But maybe just to mention, Rao, that SANEF at its recent AGM, one of our senior editors, Katie Katopodis, one thing that she's quite passionate about is the mental wellness of journalists. And we have established a committee particularly focusing on that, on mental wellness of journalists, and we are doing that. On the other issue, and I think the report also highlights that briefly, is the issue of the unionizing of journalists. And I think we have mentioned this, where we keep on reiterating that as an organization, we are not a union. But we have always said that perhaps journalists can step up and start organizing themselves across, where they say we need to unionize ourselves because the current unions that are out there are not talking to our needs, and they are not talking to what we need to do and how those needs need to be addressed. Thanks, Ayan.
Apologies, let me perhaps add this by using you as an example. If you can just for now keep it to one thought and one question, just so we can ventilate as many of the issues, and then I'm happy to come back again thereafter. But thank you very much for that contribution.
My name is Isaac Menar. I'm with SANEF, where my focus is on access to information, media policy, sustainability, and so on. And until a few years ago, I was editor of the SABC Digital News. I have 4 issues, so I'm trying to figure out which one. So let me start with remarks on related to the way forward, right? So I see there's references in the document to the 2002 African Declaration on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information. I assume it is because the term that's covered in the report is from 2018 to last year, that there's no reference to the 2019 updated Declaration on Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information. I see there's also a remark that the indicators get updated every few years. So I would strongly recommend that for next year's report, and I hope there will be a report next year, that you have a good look at the 2019 declaration and make some updates to the indicators on that. In particular, there are 2 new sections in the updated declaration. The one section is on access to information, which to summarize and goes further than the 2013 African Model Law on Access to Information. So it captures some of the latest principles with a very strong emphasis on the issue of proactive disclosure, especially in the digital age. It also deals with issues like that you refer to in this report as shortcomings, the need for digital record keeping and access to those by the public. The new section on online rights, for instance, deal with issues like universal access to information. There's also in the media section a very strong or couple of strong clauses relating to how media should be supported and sustained by states. And South Africa, there's serious shortcomings in how South Africa supports its media sector if you look at it in terms of the new declaration. So another point that is touched on in the declaration, but between news and social media, the number of developments over the past few years that should be included in an updated declaration. And on that, I just want to say over the past 2 years, on a PAIA reform initiative, to the extent that we have had now several civil society to finalize a draft amendment act. So PAIA was promulgated in 2001. It doesn't take account of the African model law, of the declaration that I spoke about. So all the issues in there, from proactive disclosure, online access to information, meaning whatever companies and government institutions need to publish in their PAIA in information accessible in terms of PAIA, they now need to proactively disclose online. So we will soon announce a final opportunity and an opportunity for civil society and others to endorse an updated PAIA. fit for purpose for the digital age, and that will really provide universal access to online information, and we hope that we can get support for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, I want to break just from the questions for a moment to get some of the responses from the panel, and perhaps to distill the questions themselves and the remarks, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Part of what I think is worth ventilating is there something to be said about us in the media being open and upfront in criticizing each other, even to the point where we go into details around people, for instance, who apparently are having cozy relationships, et cetera, et cetera. Often, what I've suspected is that there is a fear to do that, to be critical of colleagues in the media. And what does that mean? What's the final outcome about that? And with all the legislation in place, do we feel like it's infiltrating down? Like, does it mean anything to people, do you reckon, that there is amendments to the regulations and what that means about people's relationship with information and the media itself? Oliver, I'm not sure if you're still with us. Perhaps you can take the latter, and then Hao, I'll give you a moment to respond.
Yeah. Can I take that, actually? I am still here. So there's a clear limit about how much it is we could reflect in the report about what was said in the room. Some of us were there criticizing our employers. We don't want to face retribution because of that. And so people's names and direct quotes, for instance, were taken out of that. This is why, for instance, I mentioned earlier that we're not allowed to mention who said what in the room, in the panel, as we had these discussions, and that I was playing my hand a little loose there with directly quoting Gao. But it's for those sorts of reasons. It's, again, so that we can have as deeply reflective a report as possible, so that people don't self-censor as a result of that. But I think the substantive question is more important here, and that's the question around, do we have an environment where we can criticize each other as media practitioners? We certainly don't. Not in a time where, media reporting has become, one, hyper-competitive, and Gao and Tapiso has given you all the reasons why that's the case. But two, it's also become polarized, often in partisan ways. And we know that, especially when things come to things like specialized reporting, right? The best financial journalists in this country have very close relationships with some of the best CFOs and the best CEOs of listed companies, and they're able to get information before everyone else and that sort of stuff, and that relationship matters, right? Some of the best political reporters in the country are in those positions because of relationships and in some instances even friendships that they may have with certain politicians, and they're able to broker those for information. And that's really the trick of the trade, right? It just is that oftentimes and sometimes those relationships overstep the bounds of credibility. And that's what we need to be able to police a little bit better. And I think that falls on the shoulders of editors and media owners. Yeah. But importantly, when it comes to just criticizing each other about just the quality of our work and saying, hey, Ayanda, I think you could have done that broadcast slightly better in that sort of way. Or, hey, Gao, I think that one article you wrote up lacked a little bit in this and that. We certainly don't have that constructive criticism environment because, and this is to ourselves, journalists are also people made up of feelings and egos, and that often gets in the way of that developmental agenda.
Sure. Gao?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Oliver just said, and I just wanted to just touch on a little bit on SANEF and say it would be, I've had access to some of the initiative that SANEF does. I think the work that needs to be done is to sort of make it more accessible, because I do think in a lot of ways SANEF does do a lot of important work, but there is also a question of who is in SANEF and who do they represent. Tricky. We talked about it earlier. Tricky. And I think what Oliver's talking about in terms of the space to criticize each other, I think it's still, like you said, journalists are people, journalists are human, and I think it's easier to criticize other people more than others. And some other people hold way more social capital and power than others do. I remember there was an article in the Daily Maverick by a veteran journalist that was under opinion piece. And I can't remember his name now. I don't know what's happening to my head today. Mommy brain. And that article was not factual.
Yeah.
And when...
It's not Jacques Paul, is it?
It is
Yeah, it was a
Jacques
Jacques
Paul.
Paul article, sure.
And I mean, Jacques Paul is one of the people that we were told to look up to, and I think he's allowed to make mistakes. But the way in which accountability was done there for me, I don't think it was fair. I think people like that make mistakes because of the type of power they are just given to just do what they can and the kind of social capital they have. I don't know if I made the same mistake, I would have, been treated the same way. But I think a lot of that was unfair. But I think there's a lot of things that happen, man. I talked to you earlier about racism as well. I mean, there's a lot of articles that are written in such a way that it's quite racist. I do understand that we can call out corruption, we can call up the leaders of this country, but the lens at which you write your article as a media practitioner, it should matter how you write it. It should matter how you refer to black people. It should matter how you refer to women, no matter how angry you may be. Racism should not be acceptable.
Sure. A lot to think about. I want to overtly acknowledge that we are on borrowed time. According to the schedule, by now we should have said our thanks and everything, at least insofar as the panel is concerned. So I'm going to be way stricter with time, by the way. So if there are any other questions, reflections, keeping in mind, of course, that we're never, ever going to be able to get to everything, I'm more than happy to take those, and then we'll thank you. So in the meantime, if you want to respond to some...
I just want to speak to this naming and shaming of journalists who are deemed to be crossing the ethical line in the gathering of information. I think the point was made that this is part of the game as well, cultivating relationships, the extent to which and the things you do to get information. Well, I mean, I think we all have our own moral code, and we know, what is acceptable and what is not. But we also have to then have a more deliberate conversation about, if we're saying we're going to professionalize this industry, streamline it down to the type of qualifications, the kind of conduct, even if it means we need to take an oath, so that when we say we cross this line, these are the ramifications thereof, then let's have that conversation, because I think some of these things are a bit abstract. People start saying we have a rate card, and then they're comparing talent, but then you're talking apples and cherries here, and people applied according to their own wiles and whims. So standardization is then very important if we're going to have a holistic view of the profession. But also, I want to talk about the issue of how we deal with information. Do we have an industry where there is openness for journalists to speak amongst each other, with each other? The answer is no. There is a great level of fear, and I'm going to truncate this as much as I can. We were speaking about diversity, the LGBTQI+ community. I recently had an incident like that where somebody, a colleague, called me out, said all kinds of things, couched it with a few compliments here and there, but pretty much it was a lynching, and after that I was called homophobic, all of those things. And so my bosses send this to me, and I say, let me deal with this individual, because I have respect for this person. So I engaged them, and it was constructive conversation. And I said to them, you understand more about this world, and I want you to teach me. I read material, the things I don't understand, and I ask friends. But I'd really appreciate it if you could, when you see me make a mistake. And by the way, what happened was my hesitation wasn't necessarily out of ignorance. Live broadcasting is what it is. Anybody who knows will know. So you appear a bit stupid sometimes, but it's because there are a lot of things happening. So I think instead of, the report mentions it, that there's a lot of talking down to younger journalists, calling out in public spaces. That really shouldn't happen. I think as somebody whose intention is to build and to inculcate growth, we really shouldn't be doing that. I mean, there should be room for you and I talking to each other to say, you went this way with that conversation. Why is it that? Actually, you might be surprised that we can learn from each other. So that's very important to note. And I was very interested to hear about the amendments that Sabc was speaking about, because I think that the intention of it all, there's the spirit of the law in these acts, but how to actually actualize them and the things that we struggle with. I mean, we can say it works very well, that the state does provide information, but it's about pointed information. As journalists, we don't have the time. We're not in a legal office to go through reams and reams of paper. So sometimes people can say they're providing you with information, but they obfuscate it by giving you even unnecessary information, and therefore you don't even know what you're looking for, and you can be misguided in your understanding or interpretation of what it is you're getting in the information. Sorry.
Describing
reporters, the people on the ground who are facing the worst of these issues that we're discussing are disempowered to advocate for themselves and to basically do the best possible job that they could. If you're stressed, if you're underpaid, if you're harassed, how can you do a good job as a media representative? And I think that it's about time that media leadership started to show, I don't know, we need better ideas than the ones we currently have right now. It's not fair that the youngsters, and especially young people, who have to bear the brunt of what's wrong with our industry. So I would like to appeal for more understanding, more resourcing. I don't know who from. I don't know who we're asking this from. The government, our Lord in heaven, I don't know. But my point is that and I'm speaking about someone who's out of day-to-day journalism, partly for the reasons that we're talking about now. I think that our ability as young reporters, as young journalists, to tackle our problems within the industry and then produce much better results when we're serving the public, which is ultimately what we would be doing, if questions of worker power in their respective newsrooms was taken seriously. Yeah, I won't go into it too much. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's right on time. All right, just before we go back to that hand, are there any other new ideas and concepts that anybody would introduce, keeping in mind, of course, that time is not on our side? We'll get this quick thought, hint, hint, and then we'll get a reply, and then hopefully we'll be able to say our thank yous.
Oh, thank you, Ayanda. Mine is a question actually directed to Khao. She mentioned that while she was tweeting during some major news event, there was a DM that came in and said that you're limiting your career. I'm from Media Monitoring Africa, and we initiated online platform called Real 411, where it's open for members of the public to report instances of harassment, particularly of media practitioners, hate speech, dis and misinformation, as well as incitement to violence. So what we've been seeing in Real 411, particularly when it comes to the harassment of journalists, is that it's been coming from bots or accounts that are newly created, basically accounts that don't necessarily have power to end your career. So I was actually taken aback when you mentioned that the DM you got was something along those lines. So I was curious to find out who was it? Was it really from a person of social standing? And if that's the case, perhaps maybe you should report on Rule 411. But unfortunately now you've left the fraternity. But this goes to the rest of the journalists in the room, because something really definitely has to be done about it. It is harassment because it was meant to intimidate you, for you to cower and not continue with the story. As I've said, what we are used to is bots or accounts that are not necessarily powerful accounts. Thank you.
It was someone who is in a position of power. It was dealt with. I didn't report it to that unit per se, but it was dealt with at work. It was someone in government. There was a meeting held. Things were sorted out, but it's something that I'm not going to talk about at this stage. Yeah.
So this is not a reply, it's a new issue. There are two important developments regarding the SABC that I don't think is reflected in the chapter. And particularly on point 3.5 on editorial independence. The first thing is that the SABC joined the Press Council. So while it has traditionally been overseen by the BCCSA in terms of public complaints, for its online content, it joined the Press Council. But even more significant, when it reviewed its editorial policies, which MMA can help me, was it published in 2020, right? In 2020, it then, everywhere in the new editorial policies, it says that both its broadcast and its online services should adhere to BCCSA and Press Council codes. So effectively, the SABC has voluntarily decided that the press code will govern their broadcast content. There's no reason why they should have done it. And I think it is a really good sign about editorial independence and holding themselves accountable to the country. And then just a small correction. On page 10, there's a reference to PUPIA, the Protection of Personal Information Act. And it says, some lobby groups have requested that journalists be made an exemption to this rule. It's true, but it happened 10 years ago. And when the Act was adopted about 10 years ago, that exemption was actually included. So journalists are excluded from PUPIA as long as they adhere to a code such as the press code. Thank you.
And that opens all kinds of discussions, which hopefully we'll come back to. Okay, last voice, and then, well, are there two last voices? Okay. Sentiment in the room. Are we good with that? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I don't think this is a direct response, but rather I think it's like a direct contribution to what Tshepiso said. I think, first of all, when it comes to what you were talking about, being called out as homophobic and everything, I think mostly with media practitioners in particular is not the ignorance, but their complicity when it comes to, what is happening within and around us, right? So I'm going to give you an example. One of the examples that I have is that one of the people that I worked with was invited to an interview, and that person had spoken privately with the producers that, listen, my gender identity should not be mentioned as an introduction in that. And the anchor did that, right? And the dangers of that do not only lie on, the person spills over as well. And I think that is literally the conversation. So having done the work of compiling a booklet with a queer organization on reporting of queer killings in particular, and having media practitioners being invited. And you could literally count the media practitioners that were in the room. And I think that tells you a lot about how the media landscape is functioning and the prioritization of the stories that they want to tell, right? So even when you are going to invite somebody and say that, you know what, you're invited to, you're in an interview, you're a queer person and everything, want to talk base about homelessness and whatsoever the case may be, there's particular individuals that are invited, and that is also an issue. So like what Oliver had said, right, when you're reporting and they're saying, you know what, committed suicide instead of died of suicide, you know. So there's also that lack of language as well that is not established, and I don't particularly think it just lies on the media practitioners in particular, but it is an all-round landscape of how people speak, right? So when we're talking about clicks and all of that, a lot of people as well just run with that because it's easier to just engage and read through. So yeah, that was like my contribution to what you were saying.
Evening, people. My name is Richard. Myself, I'm a whistleblower. Now, I'm referring the media fraternity as a whistleblowers fraternity because there are a lot of threats there and all of that and all of that. Last weekend, we were there in Ilovo, in the Gibbs, discussing about the way forward of the president to support the whistleblowers and to ensure that their livelihood is also covered. Then when I get scrutinize the whole atmosphere of the media practitioner, I do agree with my fellow brothers that there's a need to make an independent structure for you where you will raise your concerns to the government. This is the time that you have to stand up to establish that. But it requires people who will help you in terms of the legal framework and all of that and all of that. I think the game is in your court to go around all this conflicted atmosphere made by the people around you. You know very well if you are a human being, being independent with your mind, talking truth to power, it's not everybody can like you. Now there's a need of you also to think deeper, to say the game is in your court. That's what I was trying to say you do also have the power to establish, to represent yourself as who you are and what you are encountering and what you don't want and what you want. I think South Africa is a very interesting country. It just requires you to come down and look things in a different perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. South Africa is an interesting country, to put it lightly. So thank you very much indeed for that. All right, so typically I find that in a context where so many things are said and it's impossible to address everything, we should give a moment just for closing remarks that are, I guess, focused on one particular thing. And I'll give you a moment to think about that, how Tshepiso and Oliver. But Mbali, we haven't forgotten about what I'd signposted initially. I was hoping you'll be able to speak to us about the kind of support specifically that you reckon ought to be made available for people who are working at the level that you do, in a context where we all agree that that work is incredibly invaluable.
Yeah, thank you, Ayanda. Before I respond to that, I just want to say, sitting here listening to the panelists express their challenges, I just am amazed at how you survive in this environment. And I think as I'm sitting here also, I'm saying to myself, the mainstream media can learn a lot from us. Sure. You know, in terms of when you're talking about self-correcting each other and you know the responses that you get from the person you are trying to assist with information or with the advice that you are giving. We do that on a regular basis as publishers and then downstreaming it to our journalists. because I think that improves the level of work that we produce at the end of the day. There were instances in around 2012, 2015, where the AIP would call publishers and actually point out the faults in their publications, for instance, to say, correct the layout, correct the way you do your photographs and all of that. And rightfully so, people would do that. Publishers would actually improve their publications through the way in which the sector was talking to them. So I think we do a lot for our publications. I am a layout person. I do stories. I do editing. I do the whole. So I know from the beginning of my publication till the time it goes to print, I know where each and every step that we have to go through. So I think I just pity you, I must say. But I think at the end of the day, it depends on the level of work that you do. We are totally in opposite directions, but I just wish you well, and I hope you will gain strength from our support as well when we say we wish you well, all the best in your endeavors to forge ahead and not give up on what you are doing in your newsrooms. Coming back to your question on the way forward, I should put it like that. I think the main thing for our sector is recognition at this stage. We need community media, especially print, to be recognized as a very big sector. There's over 240 publications countrywide, with a print run of about 5 million copies every month. And a lot of people do not know that. So it's a wide sector, and countrywide we serve a lot of grassroots communities who really appreciate the work that we do. But in return, the recognition is very limited in terms of the support, which I mentioned earlier. And support in this instance talks to financial support, obviously. That's the main thing for us to sustain our publications. We rely on advertising support, and we get that through government, stroke GCIS, through municipalities that we are based at. And in some instances, you find there's resistance to support print media as opposed to broadcast. And that is a challenge which we fight as the AIP, which we fight as groupings in the various provinces that we are based. But it's an ongoing struggle, which we hope we will win one day. But I think recognition for us would mean that we are able to sit in an environment like this and share our story, because I know most of the delegates that are here are not familiar with our sector. Being old school, I drafted a 5-page document which I thought I would present today, but I will send it to Pindile just for the delegates or whoever is reading to get an understanding of the sector that we are in and the valuable input that we have when it comes to the media sector. We also want to, when we're talking about support, we also talk about strategic partnerships. We do have support from SANEF. We have a very solid relationship with SANEF, and it has been both financial and, of course, in access to information and training and all of that. And to mention one person specifically, Isaac Minar has also been very helpful to the AIP, and we appreciate his support in that instance. Coming from somebody who was in broadcast,
right.
Being able to assist us in print means a lot, because he's coming with a different angle that we never thought we should look at. You know, things like we used to, when we were having meetings, would often say stories, these stories. And he said, no, maybe we should change the wording and say content, let's put content.
Yeah.
Because that's the way, that's the lingo of that is being, done. That's how it's being done today. So such things, those partnerships are working for us with universities, Rhodes University also assist us with training for our journalists and us as well as publishers, and CETA also. So it's a huge pot of industries that have come to the party and have ensured that the AIP is sustainable. And a sustainable AIP obviously means a sustainable sector.
Absolutely.
Because we are able to filter down whatever we have to publishers, not financial at this stage, but in terms of information, in terms of training, and in terms of access to people like Sabc and SANEF. And yeah, I think finally it's just financial support, which we hope we will get as we move along.
There was a hope from above, the final support somewhere at some stage. But absolutely, you're coming through loud and clear. And once again, no overstating the importance of the role that you play. And I'm glad we're able to have your voice featured here today as well. So with everything being said, I hope you've also had time simultaneously to distill what you reckon the take-home at this point should be. Oliver, I'm going to start with you, joining us virtually. My first question to you was around whether or not you're worried about the state of SA media. I wonder whether or not that's improved or worsened during the course of our discussion. I'm going to restrict you to 2 minutes.
I certainly do want to bring it back to that and say that it's productive that we discuss all the things that are wrong and possible solutions for it. But we must take the report holistically into account. And again, on very critical indices on this barometer, the country scores really high. And it's important that we note that South African media and journalism is still very much in a good place. It's not all doom and gloom. Obviously, certainly could be better, but we're in a good place. That's the first. And I think the second is, and I want to speak to the value of this report. I don't want this report to gather dust and just be just another report that reflected. But if you read the report, very obvious solutions will pop up to into your face around what can be done. For instance, there are some good ideas in the report that popped up in conversation around how certain newsrooms can consider how to do training, for instance, and how to integrate it into its culture. But also important stuff about newsroom culture, just in general, around treatment of staff, those things have come up here. The pay disparity. I know the gentleman from SANEF earlier on anecdotally referred to himself and his, editors that worked under him and said, well, but I'm well paid and they were, and I certainly earned more than them. There's no problem. No, there certainly is. It's not useful to anecdotally say, there is no problem. I think we must look at media holistically. But what it also calls for is more, the word Tepiso used was professionalizing the industry in such a way that it's streamlined. And and part of that means that it's about the collection of data. Collecting data on how much people earn, for instance, is an important start to be able to regularize that part of the industry so that we make sure that people are paid what's due to them and what they're worth, and that we don't have some people paid more because they buddy with the editor-in-chief or with the executive producer, whatever the case may be, so that there's some sense of uniformity, and that's particularly important as well. So some of these solutions will pop up to your face, it will make for useful engagement in our various parts of the workplace, and not just in media. I think civil society should have a good look at this. I think business community should have a good look at this. And I do think government certainly should have a good look at this, and realize that there's incredible value in this. To everyone in the room, I do think that there might be some barometer, some indices to the barometer that you think are important. And it's important that we continue that conversation and be able to pick that up. But from my end, and I just want to leave it here, South African media is in a good place.
All right. On that optimistic, upbeat note, Khao?
I'm also optimistic. I think I won't say much about what Oliver just said. I think he covered it all. But I just want to say I'm excited because there's a whole lot of opportunities in the media in how we tell stories. I'm so passionate about digital storytelling, and I think we should take advantage of that landscape. Don't turn down ideas from young people that they have in telling stories. People are now enjoying bite-sized news, and it's very hard to deliver bite-sized news, but there's opportunities for that. For example, there's that Scene TV, storytelling through your cell phone. I found that quite interesting. Some form of journalism, they do an in-depth interview with you, and they are ensuring that people around the world tell their story their own way. This is the question about diversity and how we bring across people's stories and how many people we cover in the media. So I think we shouldn't stick to the old ways of doing things. We should allow ourselves to expand, and young people have great ideas on how to do it. Let's not turn them down. Let's take over these opportunities, and let's not be intimidated by new media. Let's take it over. Let's challenge it. Let's be part of it. Let's be excited about it, and tell stories in innovative and new ways. I think we are in exciting times as much as we are in very horrible times.
Yeah, whether or not you ignore it, it's there, so you might as well acknowledge it. Tsepiso.
So I thought my final train of thought will be around one word: funding. And obviously that's broad. Funding for community media outlets, funding for better collaborations with community media outlets, with civil society organizations. As you said, you attended a workshop that was supposed to enlighten those who are behind the microphone, behind the camera, about the type of language which should be used. By the way, if it was shared more broadly, you probably would have greater attendance. I would have loved to come to something like that. Exposure, that also comes with funding. Multiple sources of knowledge, it was actually something that I jotted down here that you had in the report. It was point 2.2 about public access to domestic and international media sources, not restricted by state authorities. I was gobsmacked at the onset of this conflict in the Ukraine when all of a sudden RT was taken off DSTV. I used to channel hop. I'd go to Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, whatever, to get my source of information and get those different perspectives, because that's how we have a more fuller picture of what is going on. So funding for the availability of myriad sources of information that is not controlled by lobby groups or state, because if you want better informed newsrooms and you say you need to improve fact checking, so you've also got to plow money into that. Funding for what we spoke about, better pay, better working environments, and training. So that's just the buzzword for me, and I will be more optimistic about the sector if we're saying that we're going to put more money into it. And I'm not just talking about people having specialist projects in mind where they are aiming to change the narrative to suit them. Just so that we have that plurality of voices that we say is important, that diversity. It's not possible for us to reflect each and every single one of us in this room, in this country, if we don't invest in it. We respect that which we invest in. They say you are who you spend your time on, or thinking on, or occupying your mind with. And you know what they say, put your money where your mouth is. So when you do that, I think we'll have better results. But I think what I like about what we have now is a younger generation that is far more outspoken, that stands up for itself. For us, I remember my first story, very quickly anecdotal. I was on a taxi, I didn't know where I was going. Apparently it was a country club here in, is it Ilovo? Am I correct?
Yeah, there's Ilovo.
And Morgan Chanyarai was here. That was a big story of the day. And I got there late because I didn't know where I was going. And when I got there, I said, excuse me, can you tell me what is going on? And they said, do your own research.
Sure.
And that was that. But that was a good lesson as well, because then I learned how to hustle for myself. So I'm saying there are lessons that we can learn for ourselves, but some of these things we shouldn't have to pay money for. Absolutely. If we have more, gatherings like this, more fora where we talk about issues.
Yeah, loud and clear. And hopefully whatever the lingering sentiment may be among the panelists, Oliver listening virtually, and anybody else who's joining us not in the room, I hope at the very least there is this unanimous feeling that Data and information matters. And at the very least, those are important matrices for any vibrant democracy. And that's why this mattered. So on that note, Tsipiso Makwetla, Mbali Dlomo, Kgaophale Etsile, and Oliver Dixon joining us virtually. Thank you for your time, your generosity, your insights. Our conversation wouldn't have meant much if there weren't people listening to every word that you were saying. So to you also joining us in the room and virtually, thanks for your time and your generosity. Really do appreciate it. At this stage, I'm not sure if there's any closing remarks from Pindile. All right. Thank you once again. Please, a round of applause for everyone who was involved. Thank you.
Masipapindeni izandla kwakhona. Enkosi, thank you to everyone here. I think for me this conversation just sort of proves the value of this instrument, the fact that we had such a generative conversation, which wasn't only just about the problems and the challenges, as much as those are important, but it was also forward-looking. And I think I came into this room also a bit anxious about whether I would actually get to discuss the forward-looking stuff about the media landscape, and I think we've done just that. But also the conversation was also intergenerational, which I really, really appreciated. Intergenerational in the sense that you've got people with different experiences, having spent lots of time and have, dedicated their careers. And then you also had insights from people who are also younger and reflecting from that standpoint. I think that for me was quite important. But it was also cross-sectoral in a sense. And I mean, I do want to thank especially Mbali for coming through and bringing in that conversation. We had hoped that MDDA would be here actually for this conversation, because they are also an important voice and an important player in terms when we speak about support and the support that is required. But, I mean, we are keen, and when I say we're talking FES Media, FES Media in Namibia, as well as us here, we are keen for this report to travel. And by travel, I mean generating more conversation and getting people, like-minded people, around the room to chat more about what needs to be done. So that's going to be important and critical. And for that, we are asking for your ideas and your suggestions. So feel free to drop me an email, to give me a shout-out on Twitter and so on. Please do that. We really, really do not want this to gather dust, but we want it to generate conversation. But we also want to prepare ourselves for the next cycle of reporting, and we also want to start early. So we're taking all the comments about the methodology on board, we're taking all the comments about the composition of the panel on board, and our doors are open to have further discussion on that. With that, I want to thank everyone, most importantly, the panelists who put together this report. Who are in the room, please raise your hands, because you are here. I see Bev, Asonele, Usipo, and please just raise your hands, say hi. And it's a panel of experts from the media, but also from civil society. And I think that is so important. With those words, I'd like to end here and just make the announcement. I think we all need a body break. We've been sitting here and so attentive. We need a body break. So maybe let's take 10 minutes or so. Drinks are going to be served in the balcony, and the idea is for us to network. But let's get our body breaks and then move on to the balcony, and then we'll make an announcement about what follows next. Is that all right? Thank you very much. Thanks.